Hi, this is Rabbi Sammy Bergman, and I'm going to discuss Kinah 41, which we recite on Tisha B'Av Day, written by the Maharam of Rotenberg. The title of this topic is When the Torah Was Burned. Most of the kinos that we recite on Tisha B'Av discuss the destruction of the temple, or discuss the horrific tragedies our people have experienced over our history, which resulted in the tragic deaths of Jewish people, whether it's the pogroms, the people that were killed when the temple was destroyed, description of the children of the Kohen Gadol. But in this Kinah, the Maharam of Rotenberg described his reaction to something else, something a bit harder to place in this day of mourning. To give a bit of historical context, it was in the year 1236 that an apostate, a Jew who converted to Christianity named Nicholas Donin, sent a letter to Pope Gregory IX, leveling 35 accusations against the Gemara, against the Talmud. This wasn't simply a question of the Talmud being an antithetical or a sort of racist sort of work. The problem was that at the time they wanted all the Jewish people to convert to Christianity. That was the church's stance at the time. They saw the Talmud, the Gemara, as an impediment to that effort. The Talmud would stop the Jewish people from converting. And on that basis, they wanted to rid the Jews of the Talmud, of the Gemara. In 1240, Rav Yechiel of Paris, Rav Yechiel mi-Paris, who was the head of Yeshiva of Paris at the time, nobly defended the Talmud in a disputation, the first public disputation of its kind, against all the accusations of the church, but ultimately the verdict was a foregone conclusion. And then in 1242, just a few years later, after the many manuscripts of the Talmud were confiscated, 24 cartloads of the Talmud were burned at Place de Grève, which is a public square right outside the Notre Dame Cathedral. This Kinah 41, which is written by Maharam of Rotenberg, the Maharam, a great Torah scholar in his own right, and a disciple of Rabbi Yechiel of Paris, who witnessed this burning of 24 cartloads of the Talmud. This Kinah is a description of the grief he felt upon experiencing this tragedy. And it's worth noting that at the time there was no printing press. And the Maharam of Rotenberg makes it very clear that he saw this event as not just the burning of a few books, but as a challenge to our very tradition, as if the Torah itself, our entirety of tradition, was burned. I'd like to go through a few themes of this Kinah. We begin with just the very notion of the whole Kinah, which is the personification of the Torah. The Kinah begins, Sheali Srufa Be'esh, Shlom Avilai. Ask that which is burned in fire. Inquire about the peace of those who mourn over you. Yes, you here is the Torah. Meir is addressing the Torah and trying to contextualize this tragedy, understand what has happened, properly appreciate the gravity of this tragedy. He talks to the Torah itself, as if in conversation with it. The first theme that he expresses to the Torah is one that's really worth focusing on, and it is a theme of longing and yearning. In this Kinah, Rav Maharam of Rotenberg asks some very tough, difficult questions of theodicy, of justice, which can be viewed as a sort of complaint against God, against how the way that God ran this world. How could this have happened? And it's therefore appropriate that Rav Meir puts this all in the context of a feeling of loss, of mourning, of yearning, of longing. Rav Meir is saying, we long for the Torah. We long for that relationship with God. We want so much to have the Torah, to learn it in peace, to study our tradition. It's all we want, and we can't have that. We're broken. And it's in that context that we're about to talk about what's happened to us, to voice the feelings that we feel, to voice those questions. It's not because we want to complain, it's because we're broken. We see this in the beginning of the Kinah. There are many references to that longing. The first line here says, Hamit avim shchon b'chatzer zbulayeh. Rav Meir tells the Torah, ask about those who long for you, who long to dwell in your courtyards. Hashoafim ba'afar aretz, who yearn to roll in the dust. You, the Torah, you've been burnt. You're burnt. There are ashes are on the ground. We want nothing more than to roll in the dust with you. Holchim chashechim ve'eino God. They walk in the dark. There's no light. Ve'kovim la'or yoman. They just pine. They hope for the light of day. Asher yizrach aleim v'alayich. The light should shine upon them and you. All they want is to learn Torah in peace, and that's been taken away from them. And so, before beginning on the actual Kinah, the actual elegy, the actual words of mourning and grief, and all the problems that the Maharam of Rotenberg voices in this Kinah, he sets the stage by saying this comes from a place of longing for you, God, from longing for your Torah. The next thing the Maharam of Rotenberg voices is the problem of theodicy. Maharam says it's one thing for us to be punished, but how could you punish us by taking away our Torah? And how does it make any sense that the nation that is so cruel and barbaric, that is so hypocritical, gets to enjoy peace and prosperity while they punish us for just learning your Torah? The Maharam continues, Echa netuna be'esh ochla tu okal be'esh basar. Lo nichvu zarem b'chachalayach. How is it possible that the Torah which was given be'esh ochla, the Torah which is described as consumed by a heavenly fire, is now being consumed by a manly fire? A fire which was created by flesh and blood. And these zarim, these strange people, these barbaric people, they don't get consumed by that same fire where the Torah gets consumed. How does that make any sense? It's not right. How long will this adinah, this delicate, pampered nation just enjoy peace and tranquility, while Panei Prachai, the flowers, the Jewish people, the sprouts of Jewish youth that just want to learn Torah, their kisuk harulayach, their faces are covered with thorns and thistles. Teishe barov gavad lishbo b'nei el b'chol mishpatim etavi b'fleilayach. Look at that. Maharam of Rotenberg points out that they made a court case over it. Historically, they had a judge sit over the trial of the Torah, as if to say that they were a just people, that they were simply adjudicating a guilty party. Yet all along we know there was no justice here at all. It was simply persecution. All they wanted to do was burn the Torah because they were jealous of it, because they didn't like it. And they pretend to themselves as if they're righteous judges. And how do you allow that, God? How do you allow them to mete out such an unjust sentence in the guise of justice upon your Torah? How can this have happened? O tigzar l'srot dat eish v'chokim, and they made a decree to burn the law of fire. L'chein ashrei sheyeshan lach mulayach, referencing the phrase from Maharam of Rotenberg. Praiseworthy is the one who pays back what you are owed, he says, to the Torah. Praiseworthy is the one who pays back these evil barbarians for burning you, because that's what they deserve. They're going for justice, well, they deserve justice. That is the first part of this Kinah. Again, just noting the theodicy here. He doesn't understand. Again, this context of longing and yearning, voicing to God, how does this make any sense? How can it be that these barbaric people get to burn the greatest gift you've ever given to us? The Holy Torah, godly, ethical work that we have in this world, and they burn that, and they sit there untouched, unsinged by that fire. And then the next part of the Kinah, the Maharam moves from the themes of theodicy and focuses simply on the problem at hand. And the problem is, if the Torah is an eternal book of divine instruction, it's supposed to be our guidebook for how we survive in this world for eternity, then what does it mean that it's gone? Again, the Maharam sees this as not simply a few books being burned. He sees this as the verdict of the Torah itself being destroyed, our connection with tradition. And although, of course, we can still learn Torah, it's worth noting that we've lost so much in this persecution. In our physical suffering, we shouldn't lose sight of our spiritual suffering. How many traditions we've lost, how many manuscripts we've lost, how much Torah we've lost. There's the greatest sages of Ashkenaz, some of the greatest Torah scholars of the early 10th century, 11th century, 12th century, the greatest Torah scholars, we've lost everything from them. We barely have any of them. They were killed in the Crusades, their children were killed, and we lost their Torah. And the Maharam says, but Torah is eternal. Torah is supposed to guide us eternally. So how is it possible this happened? How could this have been burned? How are we to go on? How are we to proceed? Maharam says very poetically and angrily, you could sense the anger. Sinai, which talks to Har Sinai, the place where the Torah was given. Really? Is this why God chose you, Har Sinai, the smallest mountain, and He didn't want the great mountains? Is it because you were a small, lowly mountain because the Torah was destined to be desecrated, to be denigrated, to be lowered, to be brought down? That's why, Har Sinai? And you can't understand this. It's like a king who cries over the feast upon the birth of his son because he knows he's going to die. Is that why we chose you, Sinai? Because God knew we were going to lose the Torah, so He gave it on a small, lowly mountain. Again, that's not what Sinai is supposed to represent. It's supposed to be eternity. That will believe forever in God and Moshe Rabbeinu, and now it's gone. It doesn't make sense. And finally, he describes the effect it has had on him, the description of devastation, how this this tragedy has left those who try to cling to the tradition with no path forward, with hopelessness, with darkness, no way to react other than to try to compound the grief, to just cling to those feelings of sorrow and of sadness, because that's all we can feel at this point. And the Maharam just expresses how he wishes he could mourn in an even more extreme way. He continues here in the Kinah, I will cry tears until there's a river. And they will get to the two officers, the two noblemen. You're two noblemen, Torah. I'm going to cry until my tears reach your two sages. Moshe and Aaron Bahor Ahor. Moshe and Aaron. Again, referring to this conflict of the Torah being an eternal work, but now not being eternal, but being burned. He asked Moshe and Aaron, is there another Torah? Is that how this Torah was burned? Because there's not supposed to be another Torah. And I think the Maharam also references the Jewish resistance to Christianity. This is certainly in the context of the Christians of his time, who were forcing upon the Jewish people the notion that the Torah was no longer applicable. That there's a new Torah, as a new chosen nation, and you have to reject everything you've lived by until now. And Maharam says, why have we risked our lives? Why have we sacrificed our lives to cling to our tradition, to reject this notion of a new Torah, if now it's to be burned? It doesn't make any sense then. How could this be? And he continues, how could I eat? How can I bring food to my palate? And he actually echoes here the words of Rav Yehuda Halevi. Rav Yehuda Halevi says the same words. How can I bring food to my palate? Rav Yehuda Halevi says, how can I eat upon seeing the destruction of the Mikdash, upon seeing the destruction of Jerusalem, upon seeing Jerusalem in ruins? How could I eat? And Maharam of Rotenberg says a few generations later, how could I eat upon the destruction of the Torah? Jerusalem is a building. This is the Torah. Torah is our tradition. It's our connection to God. It's our spiritual survival in this world. How can I eat upon that? It's also a destruction worth grieving over. Our tradition, our spiritual survival. I don't know how to go forward. I can't find a path. That when your paths, Torah, are desolate. There's no one to guide us forward. How can I go forward? It's sort of a depression, an inability to move on. He says, I wish I could keep crying. I could just keep crying and crying and crying about how this is happening. Again, look, he says, as if God took his treasure and walked away with it. That God left us with his Torah. And I have nothing left. I'll note another line here toward the end of the Kinah. I'm like someone who lost his children, bereft of anything to celebrate in this lifetime. I'm left without my treasure, my tzor kesef, my bag of silver. Ketorem barosh har migdalayach, like a tree on top of a tower. It's worth noting the Maharam of Rotenberg himself died in a tower. And when he references har migdalayach, I'm imprisoned in the mountain of your tower, maybe he's referring to his own imprisonment, where he was stuck in a tower in prison, and he actually dies there. Maharam of Rotenberg, in trying to, after moving away from France and goes to Germany, tries to escape Germany after anti-Semitism began to emerge there, and the political status of Jews was lowered, and he got caught and he was in prison, and he refused to be redeemed from prison, and he dies in prison. Maybe he references that in this line, Ketorem barosh har migdalayach, I'm stuck like a tree on the mountain of your tower. And finally, again, after mourning and saying I can't go on, and saying how we have to mourn and mourn, the only way for him to go forward is to say that as bad as this mourning is, as bad as it is, it has to be that the redemption is going to be as good. That the redemption is going to be just as intense as this period of desecration and destruction is. He says, like the days of your pain, your destitution. God should, again speaking to Torah, you're now desolate, you're now destitute, you're in pain. God should comfort you to that extent. Referencing the phrase in Tehillim, Samchinu kimot initanu shnot ra'inu ra'ah. Gladden us, gladden us in a way commensurate to the days of our pain. And God should return the Shetei Yesharim b'yarmet shfalayah. We're going to come back, we're going to lift you up from your shfela. We're going to lift you up from how low you are. We'll be able to once again dance in the streets with you. We'll be able to celebrate with you, to bring out instruments and sing with you. It's going to happen again, Torah. Don't worry. As much as I've said I have no way forward, it's true, I'm so depressed now. The only way I have forward is the faith that this is going to end. We're going to be restored. Then only then will my heart be lifted. When your God gives you light and illuminates the darkness. I think again, we can take from this Maharam of Rotenberg is a number of lessons. Number one, see mourning as a way of not complaining, of not trying to castigate God, but a way of expressing our yearning and longing for restoration, for repair of that relationship. Number two, how devastating this was to the Maharam, my Rotenberg, Maharam of Rotenberg is crying, is devastated, has no way forward because of a few books that were burned. Many books that were burned, cartloads of the Talmud that were burned. That's how connected he was to tradition. How connected are we to tradition? How much does the Torah mean to us? How lucky we are today that we were not faced with accusations. Unfortunately, there are people till today, and that for centuries the Talmud has been attacked. And even in social media nowadays, prominent hip-hop stars question the Talmud, castigate the Talmud, and that still happens, but we get to learn it. And we get to engage in our tradition freely. And how the responsibility we had to do that, to realize the vision the Maharam just wanted to go to the study hall and connect with God through his Torah. And we get to do that. And how privileged we are to do that. And what it means to us then when we don't capitalize upon that opportunity. Further, this notion of, at the end here, I think is worth considering. How on the one hand, we're helpless without the Torah, that on Tisha B'Av we cry, and we cry today because it is that bad. It is that bad. It's worth getting on the floor and rolling in the dust. As a barometer for how horrific a tragedy everything was, it's worth doing that. It's worth not moving on. But what allows us to move on is the faith that we have in God, that he will restore that relationship, as we've already began to see, that as bad as the pain was, as Rabbi Akiva tells us, as Maharam of Rotenberg tells us, as bad as the pain was, the revelation, the redemption will be that amazing. It will be that an incredible thing to celebrate, that we will be completely rejuvenated, reunited with God, with our Torah. And Mirza Hashem, we should be able to see that day where the Maharam and all the Torah scholars will be reunited with our tradition, which our Torah, and we'll be able to celebrate in Yerushalayim, and Tisha B'Av will no longer be a fast day, but a holiday. Thank you.